A very good morning to all of you. Like always, I'm very nervous and absolutely delighted in welcoming all of you for what will be the inaugural edition of the Dialogues at Shiv Nadar School, Noida. We've already had a similar program which took place in Shiv Nadar School, Gurgaon, and we witnessed some brilliant discussions themed around India and its future. That is the intention of dialogue. We visualize this as a series of debates and discussions, intense debates and discussions, which are themed around India, the vision for India, where is it headed, what are the strengths on the way, what are the challenges serving as obstacles, and the theme, the agenda for today's dialogue is this India's century? Going forward, of course, students have to conceptualize, manage, execute this event, but today we are all here to give you a wonderful panel discussion. Our panelists are already seated here. We have with us Mr. Vikas Singh, Mr. Sumant Batra, Mr. Swapan Johri, and Colonel Gopal Karunakaran. A detailed introduction to all of our panelists I will give you in a few moments. But since we are discussing an issue of such importance and depth, we thought it would be appropriate if we began by taking your views into consideration. So, before I call any of the panelists on the stage to even begin talking, we would love to know from you, what do you think about this being or not being India's century, or where, which end of the spectrum do you all lie? So, can we have the question? Do you all have the clickers? Many of you would have been given clickers by our very capable volunteering team. All right, so you make use of those clickers and you let us know what do you feel about India's future. May we have the question, please? And you may start answering now. Is this India's century? Yes, no, can't say, maybe. Okay, not bad. That's fairly positive. But there are a lot of you who can't make up your minds. Sir, to the panelists, we have quite a task at hand then. Where will these 35% sway will be an interesting thing to note. May I now request all our panelists to please come and take their respective seats on the dais. All right, as our panelists settle down, I will start introducing our guests to you so that you also get to know which side and which area of expertise they come from. We will have a huge open house at the end of this session, so you can keep your questions, comments, views, observations ready, and we will give the forum to all of you, students specifically. So our first panelist for the day is Mr. Vikas Singh, resident editor, Times of India. He started his career as a journalist with the Economic Times, and today he's the, like I said, resident editor, Times of India. He's pursued his history degree from St. Stephen's College and went on to do a postgraduate diploma in marketing management soon after. He has co-authored a brief, breezy history of knowledge, the know of things, alongside Derek O'Brien, Jagg Suraiya, and Bunny Suraiya. The Big Fix is Mr. Vikas's first novel, and he's currently working on his second. We accord you a very warm welcome, sir. Thanks for being with us. Then we have with us Mr. Swapan Johri, who leads Strategic Engagements and Technology Services at HCL ISD and is a key member of the leadership team. He has an engineering degree from IIT Kanpur, and he started his career with HCL in 1986 as a management trainee. He has since held diverse portfolios in account management, service delivery, and strategic business initiatives. He's been instrumental in building HCL's various infrastructure service lines with a personal focus on innovative and transformational IT services. So we do hope you bring in the industry and technology aspect to this discussion today. Welcome on the panel.
Thank you.
I will skip over to Mr. Sumant Batra, who is a lawyer, social commentator, and creative entrepreneur. He's the founder and architect of a number of innovative creative projects which seek to promote Indian heritage, culture, art, literature. Some of these prominent initiatives include the Kumaon Literary Festival, the Taj Colloquium, and the Dalit Literature Festival. As a senior international consultant to the IMF, World Bank Group, OECD, and other development institutions, he has worked extensively on policy matters. He is the author of the best-selling coffee table book called The Indians. He has also set up Chitrashala, a private museum of vintage graphic art. Sir, you do wear many hats in your real life, and we hope you can give a similar perspective to our students.
Thank you.
And last, yes, thank you.
Thank you.
And last of all, we have on the panel with us a person who really does not need any introduction, but let's still tell the students a little more about Colonel Gopal Karunakaran. He graduated from the National Defense Academy, Khadakwasla, and joined the Indian Army in 1981. He served for over 11 years in Kashmir, and also had a stint with the United Nations at the Iraq-Kuwait demilitarized zone. Before being designated the CEO, Colonel Gopal Karunakaran has also served as the director of the Shiv Nadu School, playing a pivotal role in the laying down of a firm foundation of our institution. Welcome to the panel, sir. And this discussion will be moderated by me, so I will do rest of the talking from my place at the panel. I'm glad for the trickle of applauses. Thank you. All right. So, like you all know, the agenda for today's discussion is this India century? Let me set just a very brief background to this discussion. The 19th century was known as the Pax Britannica, or the British century. The 20th century clearly belonged to America, which emerged as not only a military, but also an economic, a social, an all-pervasive superpower with its soft power dominating most of the world without its own knowledge. And now with China on a major stutter, the question that we can all ask and reflect upon is this going to be the century that India can own and call its own? And to give you more informed views on this very, very interesting agenda, we have a panelist. I'll just take one moment to introduce you to the procedure, the flow of the day. We will have opening comments by all of our panelists. So we will be giving you 5 minutes to make your opening arguments. I have Shania sitting in the wings with me who will sound a little bell at 4 and then a vigorous bell at 5, which is to tell you that time is up. In the opening comments, we would love to hear from you. What do you think are the positives, the strengths that India can bank upon? Post your opening comments. I will pose some questions to some of you. And then in the second round of your comments, we want to know what are the challenges, according to you, which are coming in the way of India becoming a global superpower. We'll again have a round of questions, and largely, then we will open the house to questions from the audience, students, parents, and teachers. I hope you guys are taking down notes and you know what question to pose to whom. We're looking forward to some interesting questions coming from all of you. And before we close, we will do the clicker, the poll again, and see how much did our opinions change, if at all. And with that, I welcome the panelists again, and may we begin with comments from Vikas sir about what he thinks are India's strengths.
Okay, so am I audible at the back, or do I need to? Okay, great. So, will this be India's century? Yes, for about 250 million Indians. What will happen to the other 950 is, I think, something I'll deal with in the second round. Why will it be India's century for these 250 million Indians? Okay, to give you a little, quick background on economic history. See, the world has worked in a particular way, and that cycle has repeated itself time and time again. And typically what we've seen is that there is something called the demographic dividend, right? So the demographic dividend basically means that you have a young population just starting to come into the working age. Now, about 40% of India is below 15 years. Which would mean a lot of students sitting here. And what happens is, as this population, and this is something that has been seen in country after country. So when this population starts to enter the workforce, they get jobs. And when they get jobs, they get an income. And when they get an income, savings happen. This savings is what drives investment to a very large extent. Because you put that money into banks, banks loan it out to entrepreneurs. And simultaneously, what you're seeing in India right now is a surge in entrepreneurship. A whole lot of kids starting out, branching out, starting their own businesses rather than waiting for jobs to happen. So you have what economists call the virtuous cycle, where one good thing leads to another thing and another thing and another thing and so on, and this sort of fuels the whole spurt in growth. As luck would have it, the US witnessed this kind of demographic dividend in the last century. China did it in the last 30 years. India has this window for the next 20 years or so. So that's really what India has going for it. Also, like I said, these 250 million Indians are very well placed to take advantage of the globalized world because the high emphasis on education, there's a comfort factor with English, there is more and more migration. So I think you're going to see a whole lot more of guys like Sundar Pichai and Satya Nadella, running big corporations worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Those were very crisp comments made by you. And moving on, Swapan, sir, if you can discuss what do you think is going good for India?
Sure. Thanks, Samya. So good morning to all my friends from the millennial generation and also to all my friends from the 20th century generation. It's great to be back in school in a different context, but it feels very nice. Thank you.
Welcome.
I think I will start with a bit of a digression and just to put something in context. So as a child, one of the most exciting things I got to do was to watch a 3D movie. Usually you would see a 2D and that too at home. If at all mom, dad would take us out for another movie in the theater, that was another fun. But watching a 2D movie at home was the best excitement that you could get. But more than that was a 3D movie because you would definitely go out, right? That remained exciting till as I grew up and had a chance to visit US and I went to Disneyland and experienced a 4-dimensional show, right? And I think they not talk about a 5D show. Why am I talking about this? I think it's very simple. It's, adding dimensions adds to the fun. The more complex it gets, the more pervasive it gets, and you tend to then navigate, find out as to how will it all pan out, right? And that probably explains the maybe in the voting that we had, because there are so many dimensions to look at, right? So I think that first of all we need to have, and I'm borrowing a term from physics, you need to have a frame of reference, and you need to make it relative. And I think it's very important that the relativity is from what we want to be than where have we been. And we'll talk about this later in the session, but it's very important to understand that we should be really measuring ourselves against what we want to be and where we want to get to. So that's the relative part of the frame of reference. I certainly believe that on several dimensions, and I'll name some of them, this is India's century. Dimensions that I think will be India's century are technology, medicine, you'll be a little surprised to hear this, world peace, and maybe spirituality. I think these are 4 areas. And I'll add a 5th one, not too many people talk about it, but I think entertainment is an area where we would really be, this is our century, it's beginning to show up, right? So that's where it looks to be. And then when you add things like the extensive natural resources that India has, right? I mean, probably technology is not deployed fully, and we're not there yet. But once that's done, we would probably be reaching a level of independence, which is the other thing that we all aspire for all the time, that only a few countries can dream of. So that's something which is available to us. How we use that, of course, is dependent on how things shape up later. So that's where I see India going.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. When you said entertainment, I could just think of Bahubali for some reason, because it has been such a wonderful global grosser. And going over to Gopal, sir.
Okay, so I'm not only a guest and a panelist, but I'm also a host. So let me just start by addressing the students directly that you are the ones who are going to take this debate into the next half, which is the 45 minutes later, where we expect you to be thinking and asking a lot of questions around India and its future based on what you hear. So keep your brains open and keep thinking and ask some really nice questions and make comments. It doesn't have to be just questions. Make comments about what you see. Just taking forward from what Mr. Vikas said, 40% of India is your age and below, which is 15 years and below. 25 and below is 50%, and 35 and below is 70%. 70% of India is below 35 years of age. So obviously the youthful energy that this country has is huge, right? But before that, I'd like us to just think about when we say, is this India's century? And the 19th century was the British century, and the 20th century was American century. What did it really mean? What did it really mean? So we have to define that. In some ways, I think the way to look at it is that that country had the most influence on events in the world. And like Swapan said, that he outlined certain specific areas where India will probably have influence on the world, in technology, on spirituality. So, it's interesting to look at it like that. But you look at the colossal impact that Britain had on the world in the 19th century, and the colossal impact on America had in the world, right? So you have to look at the 21st century and say, how will India have this colossal impact on the world, right? So that's one thing that you have to think of. What is that impact, right? So obviously we have very young population. And Mr. Vikas also said that we have about 250 million people make a difference too. But you must realize, as people who are 15, and 2030 you're going to be 30, and 2050 you'll be 50, and still not as old as I am today, right? But you will have another 250 to 300 million people moving to the cities. That's for sure. It's a colossal urbanization, one of the fastest urbanization obviously ever in humanity. You have 250, 300 million moving to the cities. They're looking for a better life. They're looking for livelihood, a better life for their children. What sort of impact will that have? So obviously the energy of that population is going to be huge. The purchasing power of that population is going to be huge. So the consuming power of that population is going to be huge. And therefore we will consume a lot and our growth rate will go up. Right? So I think those are some of the real positives. And here's a question to the students in advance, but I want you to just try and answer this. What is that one thing that we have, which we got around the middle of the last century, which we should cherish the most as a developing country? Independence. And with that, democracy. So I think we should, while we flog the democracy in India for many reasons, and we don't have great respect for politicians. But I think one of the things India has going for it, as compared to many young countries, like say Pakistan or Burma on either side of us, or China, which is a little further away, but none of these countries have democracies. And I think democracy is one of the great things that we have going for us. It has its problems, but it's something we must cherish and we should be extremely proud of, right? And I have 1 more minute to say that since I'm the ex-army man, you have a great military. You need a military because you have some threats in the geography that you're in, and you have the 3rd largest military in the world, but it's a fine military, and that's one more of the strengths that you have, and we will discuss more as we go on in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Gopal sir. And Sumant sir, if we could hear from you now, what is working for India?
Thank you so much. The first thing that I'd like to sort of mention is that I was one of those amongst the 35% which pressed the option C, which is maybe, but not because I am confused or I was not clear, but because I'm very sure that the answer does not lie in yes or no. In my opinion, India has the potential to become one of the leaders as things stand today, a leading economy or a leader in a number of other areas or sectors, as were mentioned by Vikas, also by Swapan. But in order for India to make it its century, a huge amount of efforts, decision makings, some of them actually a paradigm shift in the thought process of this nation that would be required. And I can say that today it does not exist. For any nation to find its place in the global center stage, you need to have a clear, unequivocal, and unambiguous vision for that. Today as a nation, we do not have a vision to become or to convert this century into India's century. we look at it from a very narrow prism. And that prism today is, if I were to explain it in very simple terms, is to become an economic superpower. We want, or we are actually stuck with the GDPs. Our aspirations as a nation are driven by 8% to 12% shift in a GDP. That is what drives policy making every minute for this nation, which is what determines how the industry and various players around you behave. You have repo, you have RBI decisions, you have finance ministry's calls, you have market regulators making decisions which determines how this country behaves in the next 48 hours. This is not how you become a nation which aspires to be a leader of the century. In my opinion, unless India decides to develop its soft power as much, if not more, than its military power and its economic power, we will never really be able to convert this opportunity into the century of India. For us to be able to earn the respect of the international community, we just don't need to develop ourselves as a market. Because in market, people will invest to the extent their interest is served. They will come and invest in your market, but they'll go away the moment the market fluctuates. We will only become a nation which has the respect of the global community if they invest in the nation and not in its market. And for anybody to come and invest in your nation, it takes far more than just a vibrant market, a young population, a good demography, or other advantages that we see today visibly lying so easily as what you call as low-lying fruit. Now, if we are only going to aim on the low-lying fruit and not be ready to climb up the tree and pick the hard ones, they're always going to be lying there hanging and rotting. So therefore, what will it take? If I say, I'll just make one more comment, which is that, first of all, we have to change our language from impact to, beg your pardon, influence. If we are not able to influence the thinking of the world, and not just impact, we are not going to go anywhere. And the second is, if we, alongside starting to talk about 12% GDP, start aspiring of 12 Nobel laureates being produced in the next 10 years, that is when it will become India's century.
Wonderful. Thank you,
That is
sir.
what
I
I
think
was-
we can have a round of applause for the opening comments made by our
Thank you.
panelists. If I think about what were the broad points made during this discussion, one was definitely about demographic dividend, talked by Mr. Vikas and then Gopal sir. And then two of our panelists did mention soft power in different terms when you talk of spirituality, world peace and entertainment and dominating the world using those tools. You're definitely bringing the soft power perspective in. And why don't we take the discussion in that direction, you know? Ages, since times we've been called this, what do you call this treasure of multiculturalism, and we have this brilliant ancient heritage which we must need to be proud of, and while definitely we need to be proud of it, that somehow also serves as a divisive, as a narrowing force for this country which really needs to come together if it has to position itself in a certain way globally. How much is India's multiculturalism really working for us? And from this point, I will move over to education, because surprisingly, none of us have really spoken about it, and we're sitting in a school, so that's something I would want addressed. So multiculturalism, I think Sumant sir or anyone, how much is it really working for us? Is it?
Well, I think multiculturalism is probably our biggest and the most powerful asset, because what it brings in us, which no other nation has, is the power of resilience, the power of coexistence, the power of listening to other point of view, the power to stay rational, the power to stay objective, the power to stay tolerant. And all this combined together is our biggest strength, which we need to optimize on. Because not only this allows us to do what I just mentioned, but it also gives out what are the natural collateral outcomes or produce of these various cultures is that we have multiple talents in these countries. We have a 360-degree ability to think out of our own individual beliefs, which come out of our religious, cultural upbringing. So it is not that we are thinking all in one direction only. We are all thinking in multiple directions because that's what multiple culture that we have allows us to do, which means that we are way ahead of any other country in the world to be able to innovate, to be able to be creative, to be able to be a leader in the field of art, culture, literature, theater, because what we can produce as an industry in these fields, nowhere in the world can anybody compete. So therefore, we need to just make sure that how do we make sure that this asset really becomes something which we can apply on a more productive side.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for your comments, sir. Are there any follow-up comments on the same? I mean,
Yeah, I just wanted to make 2 points. So, one was I completely take Suman's point about soft power as well. But I think I'd just like to add that I don't think you can ignore the role of economic development, because you will not find any country in the world which has a strong soft power presence without having economic development.
Of course, I agree with you.
Whether it's the US, UK, wherever. So, I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. One probably leads to the other.
Yeah.
I think when he brought up multiculturalism, I think it is India's biggest asset. But it's something that we, and this is something that's particularly important for this generation, the millennials, because they are exposed to social media far more than, we were or our parents were. And I think around the world you see a rise in, I sort of hesitate to use the word intolerance, but you definitely see a rise in extreme statements and extreme emotions, whether it's Donald Trump being a Republican candidate now, or whether it's the rise of the far right in Europe, or indeed, what you see increasingly in India, because I think there have always been elements that are opposed to multiculturalism. They were there in 1947, they were there in 1984, but they were never really part of the mainstream. They were fringe elements. What social media has done is bring these voices front and center. So now they're out there, and suddenly they realize that, I'm not as isolated as I thought. There are lots of other guys like me out there, or lots of other people like me out there. So that is something that you need to be aware of. There is something called the echo chamber effect, which is that increasingly, when you're sort of friends with a particular bunch of people on Facebook, or you're only following a particular bunch of people in Twitter, you are only following the views that already reflect your own. So there is less openness to hearing another point of view, which is, I think, worrying, and which is something that I think we should guard against.
which is so ironical, social media exposes you to everything, and we still choose the silos that we want to exist in. And probably the point that sir was trying to make, in our language we call it trolling,
Yeah.
if nothing else, and
And
there are
one other
organized
thing,
trolling.
Just one other thing.
Trolls.
Do not believe anything you read on social media
Yes.
until unless it is verified.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, the number of times, once or twice we did that in the paper. We ran a picture, and then later we realized, there were the Nepal floods, and there was this beautiful picture of two young toddlers sort of hugging. And I said, so great, where is the picture from? And nobody knew. Nobody could sort of pinpoint exactly where the picture was from. So we said, acha chalo, it was a beautiful picture, so we ran it, but we said, we don't know where it is from. 2 days later, we realized it was from Vietnam. It was never been part of the Nepal floods. Then right now, we got 2 days ago, I got this brilliant picture of a deer and fire in a forest. It was a beautiful picture. And we said, this is a front page picture, this is the Uttarakhand fire. So having been sort of bitten once, I was a little shy. And I said, no, where did you find this picture? So we found it on a Facebook page. So we went back to that person and said, is this your picture? Can you use it? He said, no, it's not my picture. Feel free to use it. So we said, no, we'd really like to know, where did you get this picture from? So we sort of went backward, and finally it turned out to be a picture from the United States of America. So, just take anything you see on WhatsApp or Facebook or Twitter with a very large pinch of salt.
Yeah.
So the only one single comment that I wanted to make was that I fully agree with you, because that I do not want to, and I was never really meant to undermine the importance of economic role of economy, which of course is probably as important, if not more. The only thing I was trying to make was that in terms of the vision, unless the government decides that I want the 10 best IITs and 10 IIMs, but I also want the 10 best culinary schools which will produce the best Michelin stars of the likes of the cordon bleu chefs of this time. Because that imbalance today, unfortunately, is so patent that it doesn't bring out the confidence that today we understand the importance of all these aspects in building a nation or its place in the global center stage. That's what I really meant.
Thank you.
So-
Yes.
Sorry?
Both of you want to, okay, go ahead, sir, please.
Okay, so no, I think on the point of multicultural, I think it'll be blasphemous if I say that there is really no multiculture, but I will still go ahead and say it. I think the differences in culture that we have are probably very, very minimal. At the fundamental level, it's all the same. So in fact, whatever differences we have and which creates the risk or the issue that Soumya you were referring to are probably inconsequential if we just decide to look at it that way. So what I will go to is what complements this multiculturalism and what's really common. I think what is common for India and across everybody in India or most of us in India is the fact that this is a set of people who are extremely industrious by nature. And it could be centuries of culture, or it could be today's requirements, but we are extremely industrious. Now add to it the fact that while we are industrious, we are also extremely innovative, and we know how to succeed, how to achieve the impossible, many times in the severest of constraints. If you hear Indian stories about success, they'll all start, 80% of them will start with very humble beginnings and making it to something which nobody could have ever dreamt of, right? I think that's the common thread of culture which we should look at, and that far, far, far outweighs the risk and issue that you have. And that's the strength which I bank on when I was part of the 44% who voted as the strength, for being India, this being the India's 21st century.
Wonderful. We talked of culture and economics in one breath, and class movement and up movement. All right, and Gopal sir, you had some closing comments to make
So
on
this
that.
is for the 15-year-olds. This is for the future 25 years olds in 2025, and 40-year-olds in 2040. So I'm just sort of taking from what Vikas said about opinions and how it gets translated and spread. Multiculturalism has existed in India for thousands of years, right? So when you're in India, you don't realize the uniqueness of the country that you're in. Wherever you are, you forget the uniqueness of where you are, right? Which country in the world has how many languages?
300.
22,
No.
right? Official, and 400 or 4,000 unofficial. Which country in the world has that, right? That diversity. Which country in the world is home to how many religions? All. Okay, that's a good answer.
That's a very good
It's
answer.
a very good answer, right? We are the
Smart
third
answer.
largest Muslim country in the world. We are the third largest Muslim country in the world. So while we'll debate some of it on the other side of the break when we talk about what's not working for India and what are the threats, but it's important to know that multiculturalism, tolerance, and the sort of things which Suman spoke about is actually pervasive in India in every village, every city, every way of life, right? We live together, right? And it's given us a lot of strength, the ability to tolerate, understand others' points of view. As Suman said, this is the way we were brought up. When you compare that with other countries which were single religion, single culture, single ethnicity, they have a huge challenge when they go out to the world, right? I'll give you a personal example of when I was in Siachen Glacier, which you all would have heard of, and we climbed up, this is 1991, and as you climb up, and you're going to spend 6 months on the glacier, and every group of soldiers who climb up, normally about 40 at one time, and it takes you 4 days to get to 15,000 feet, and 1 day at 13, and 1 day at 14, and that's how you go, right? And all the soldiers go into this igloo, you know an igloo? And we all pray. And do you know what's inside that igloo? There's a Bible, there's a Granth Sahib, there's a Gita, and there is a Quran. Everyone goes and prays in the same place, right? And nobody ever thinks that this is not my religious identity, right? Everyone prays there and says, get me back safely. And the other things you would say to God. right? And that's the sort of way we've lived, and that's the way India has lived. And it's for you to look at right now, social media is power without responsibility. It's power without responsibility. Your generation is to cover that and change that and say, I'll be responsible in the way I use the media and express my opinions, or listen to somebody's opinion without really authenticating it. So I think these are some of the challenges. You have to preserve the multicultural, multi-religious identity that has given us so much.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. I did want to initiate a second round of discussion on the subject of education, but I'm going to stop myself. We will go into discussion of the challenges because we do want a lot of time for the open house. And while Sumant sir already went towards the challenges while making his comments.
I haven't.
All right, there are more.
There
are more to come. All right.
I mean, the challenges are so much that you can't, but I want to mention a few, but
Right.
I mean, I'll leave it to you to steer it, yes.
No, I will begin with you, and that's why.
You see, I mean, I don't think that I am, a leftist, that I have to oppose everything that is, which people does. I mean, I believe that we need an entire view. I mean, we actually need a ministry which proposes to do something which no other one is doing. We talk of smart cities. Why can't we talk of thinking cities? Why just we can't think beyond steel, brick, mortar? I mean, when you talk of smart cities, we say, oh, great infrastructure, buildings, obviously quality of life. But we can't think of way of life. Smart city will give you quality of life, but it won't give you a way of life. A way of life will come from a thinking city. So why can't the policymakers say, okay, we'll build 10 smart cities, but we'll also build 10 thinking cities, which cannot be built into a smart city. For example, Varanasi, you don't need to build into a smart city. You need to build it into a thinking city because that is what it always was. It was a hub of education. It produced, manufactured some of the most eminent scholars around the world. So that is what this is what I really mean when I say that you have to start thinking from a very different prism. When you are thinking of becoming a true global leader in that sense, where people will offer you a seat by choice on the center stage of the global decision making, global thought process, not because you are an economy where every country has stake, because you have multinationals from those countries having investments there. Therefore, all the time, high commissioners and ambassadors are lobbying for policy being made for them. They have to start thinking beyond that. And that degree of engagement will happen if you start thinking from the soft infrastructure point of view. The other second point that I'd like to make is what I completely agree with Gopal, which is we cannot undermine the importance of peace in this whole process. India, unfortunately, is geographically very differently positioned as America's is. We have neighbors, unfortunately, with which we do not have at the moment very, very pleasant relationships. You cannot become a superpower, even economically, if you have constant tension with your immediate leader and neighborhood, because your energy is then not channelized in the right direction all the time. These are some of the challenges. Now, look what Canada has done. Now, Canada has already announced that in the next 5 years, they will double the culture budget, but the amount of money they will spend on the culture will be doubled over the last 5 years. The European Union took a decision last year that they will spend as much amount on culture as they will spend on security measures that they're taking to combat terrorism, because that is creating so much of negativity in the region because of strict measures of security that are taken or incidents that happen of terrorism, that you need to offset that by building positivity in this society, by engaging people in art, culture, literature, theater, so that their creativity is channelized in the right direction. Where is the leadership today in India which is thinking from that perspective? We have, unfortunately, a ministry of tourism and culture which is considered to be the least important ministry, which has a very minimal budget. Part of it, in fact, significant part of it is used by the tourism rather than by culture. I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize this, but when you get a lawyer talking, that's what happens.
I don't see you so much as a lawyer, as a culture activist sitting here.
Yeah,
and
I just believe in what I'm saying. That's why I probably come out across
Rick,
too strong.
absolutely.
But that's what it is. yeah.
Absolutely, and your model around thinking in smart cities definitely left me thinking, and that's food for thought.
And we're
for
doing
a lot
one,
of
I
you.
must say that we have announced the first edition of Think Town series, which we're doing in Gurgaon, and we'll be happy to have Shinada as one of our partners in that. This has already been announced in January with all key stakeholders in Gurgaon, that we want to start a debate alongside Gurgaon being a smart city, a thinking city.
Wow,
So that's the first edition that we're doing.
that's interesting. We have a delegation from Gurgaon here. You must take that
In fact,
into consideration.
I was hoping to have a discussion with Mr. Satyaprakash on this, but maybe in a separate basis.
Yes, we do miss him on the panel today. Gopal sir, can we have your views on the challenges?
I think India's foremost challenge, which is rarely discussed in so many forums, we talk about a lot of problems, but we don't talk enough of the problem of leadership. And I think India's foremost problem is of leadership. So when you are young and you're worrying about it, I mean, the point is, so what is the solution and how do you change it, right? So I think there is a huge concern in the type of leaders that we bring to the fore, in the system that we have, that the people who take decisions. Very often I feel that the people who are led, the lay people, are a lot brighter than the people who are being who are being led by the leaders that we have. So I think there's a whole issue there about the real challenge is about the type of leaders you have, because what's the system which is throwing up leadership? It's also very interesting, I'll make this little point, that it's interesting that, okay, the government still gets a RBI governor who comes from outside the mainstream, who comes from somewhere else to lead the RBI. But look at it, if you had somebody who really understands foreign policy who actually leads foreign policy, right? Somebody who really understands governance, building smart cities, who actually comes and takes that position. So it needs radical thinking, but you know, in the army, again, there's this saying that it's better to have an army of 1,000 sheep led by a lion rather than have an army of 1,000 lions led by a sheep.
True.
So I think you have a huge problem to crack, which is how do you crack the huge issue of leadership. The other thing which we don't talk of, but it's going to impact your generation in a huge way, is the environmental disaster that we are sitting on, right? When you have, don't worry about the baby.
Yeah,
Look here,
he's
right? Is the environmental disaster that you're sitting on. You're going to have 250 million people coming to the city. And you know they need construction, they need cement, they need land, they need wood, they need water. It's sort of predicted that the water requirements of India 30 years from now is going to be double than what we're going to have, right? While on the energy side, you may have nuclear and you may have solar, and if you go quickly there and get it right, but you're not going to drink oil instead of water. You still need water, right? So the whole environmental disaster is one thing which may pull India down and pull India down in a very big way, unless we address those and look at those as a very serious sort of challenge. So the third thing which we sort of spoke in the first round is, I think, extremely important, which is that are your pluralistic traditions under threat? Are you looking at an India which is more Hindu, more Muslim, more Christian, more Sikh? Are you going to look at ourselves as more in those sort of silos as we go forward? And that is another disaster waiting to happen if you're going to think like that. Because you cannot wish away 30% of your population, right? And that is a concern that you must look at when you grow and think that you have to continue to believe in the diversity of India. And if you don't do that, that's a third thing, which is a dangerous trend which is looking ahead, and we've got to be very conscious of that. If we look at these three, leadership, environment, and our threat to our pluralistic traditions, I think these are three huge threats that we have.
right.
Someone who's raised a hand.
Do we have an audience member who's wanting to make a comment? Ma'am, can we wait till the open house? We'll definitely come to you and begin at you. Yeah, can my ushers take note of that? Thank you. We will have Swapan sir bring in his comments on the challenges India is to face. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I must talk challenges if I want to keep my friendship with Sumant. So anyway, I think to me, the most important challenge that we have, and again, this is not to undermine anything which Sumant said or what Colonel Gopal mentioned, those are definitely challenges. What I would like to add to it is that I think we need to look at a different mindset. For all the industriousness and innovation that we spoke about as the positives, I think we have a mindset of rewind. You know, so when you have that rewind button on your YouTube or wherever else, or in our days on the VCR and on the tape recorders, we as a country, as a set of people, just like to rewind. And we go to rewind and then say, we had a glorious past, we did this fantastically well, we should be proud of this, you know, so you know, we've got this great heritage. The question's not that, that's all past, right? The whole idea is to look forward. And so you have to be always looking at what's going on now or what's looking forward. If we can change that mindset and start looking at whatever we've had, what do we do with it now, what we build with it, what we go further with, is probably the most important thing that we need to attend to. The second and the last point, just to make up time for you, Soumya.
So ample time, sir. Please go on.
All right. Is the, you know, something which I will mention from an industry perspective. So this big challenge that we face today in the industry, especially in the services industry, is the fact that there is lots of knowledge that is imparted today. There are lots of education institutes, there are engineering colleges, there are universities, there are of course schools. They impart a lot of knowledge. I think India has an abundance of knowledge, right? But yet there's a lack of employability. Right? So what we lack with is and what employability for me is employability because I sometimes am not able to service my customers because I'm not able to hire. But what it means in a more general term is that you're not contributing. So you've learned, you've kept it in your brain, maybe you've kept it on a blog, but you know, that's about it. You're not able to use it. And employability comes with several skills around your core knowledge. I think getting that employability is something which, you know, all of us need to wake up to, including leadership. You know, I mean, when we go back to ministry, I think you really need to talk of a state minister who can, you know, help improve employability. And I think if we can do that, we will suddenly increase the value that everyone brings to the table.
Excellent. We are a pretty pluralistic panel ourselves, and it's wonderful to see so many comments come in. Vikas, sir.
Okay, so, you know, I think the kids have been subjected to a lot, so let's just give them 10 seconds to process, and then I'll start.
All
So
right,
that they
you
sort
have
of
10
refocus.
seconds
To process.
to process.
This is just so this is sort of catch their
No,
breath.
I understand, yes.
Okay, now that hopefully everyone's sort of focused again. So, okay, I think, you know, when we talk about, whenever we project for the future, what we sort of assume is that the future will be much like the past, that it will be normal, reasonable and predictable. And for all the kids out here, I highly recommend a book by a guy called Nicholas Nassim Taleb called Black Swans. Now, you know, why is it called Black Swans? Because what color are swans usually? Anybody? Have you ever seen a black swan? Yeah, so the whole point he sort of makes in Black Swans is that, you know, every once in a while there will suddenly be a completely random, unexpected event, which can completely disrupt everything that you've thought possible. So for example, 9/11 would have been a Black Swan event. Nobody really saw it coming. So whenever we sort of project for the future, we are assuming that there will be no Black Swan events. For example, we are assuming that, say, the Jaish-e-Mohammed will not get hold of some nuclear bombs and explode them in Mumbai or Delhi. Let's hope it doesn't happen. Or that there will not be, you know, environmental disasters, which hopefully will not happen, but if they do, they could set us back quite substantially. But let us hope that Black Swan events don't happen, and then look at the challenges ahead for India. So I think, you know, in my opening remarks, I'd spoken about how it will be India's century for 250 million Indians, but there are also another billion or so Indians out there, and you really need to worry about those. I think the disconnect to me became very, very visible this year when there was talk about IPL matches and the drought in Maharashtra. And you know, the head of the IPL said, oh, next year we'll go to Dubai or South Africa or wherever. It's just too problematic to hold the IPL in India. Now, fair enough. You know, some people say that the IPL was just being made a scapegoat because after all, the real reason you have drought is that there's extensive sugarcane cultivation happening in Maharashtra, which is not the best crop to be growing in a water deficit area. But even so, I found the disconnect very, very striking because for this gentleman, you know, what's happening out there to the people really didn't matter. What mattered to him was, I have an event to do, India's too much of a problem, let me go out. Now, that is not exactly the kind of thinking that is going to be a big help in the future. Because at some point of time, when I spoke about the demographic dividend, I think there is also the possibility that that demographic dividend could become a demographic time bomb. Because all these kids coming into the workplace need jobs and they need education. And you know, a point that Sopan made, they don't just need education, they need useful education. And by useful education, I don't necessarily mean that everybody has to be an engineer. He could be a Michelin chef as well. Correct. But it has to be a skill that is useful out there in the workplace. That is particularly critical because we are rapidly entering a cycle called jobless growth, which we seem to be seeing across the world. That you have economic growth happening, but increasingly the jobs are not happening because a lot of work that could be done by humans is being automated. So that's a big challenge you're going to have to face. How are you going to sort of bring these 1 billion people along? How are you going to address their rising aspirations? And how are you going to make sure that they do not, you know, if aspirations are not met, it turns into frustration. So how do you ensure that they are taken along as well and that we provide them a decent quality of life as well? I think that is going to be the single biggest challenge. And if we can crack that, then it will be India's century.
Excellent. So again, a round of applause for our panelists for bringing such wonderfully diverse views in front of us, so much so that I'm obfuscated where to pick from and where to lead this discussion to. But 2 points that came up starkly in this discussion were A, about education and its alignment to what lies ahead, the kind of skills that probably guarantee employability or in some manner aid the kind of vision, if at all any, that India is going towards. And the second was leadership. The people who envision for India and the people who lead India, are they helping us move in a certain direction? So if I pick from leadership, and if I can pose a question to Gopal sir, how is the education sector poised at nurturing leaders, or is leadership something that can even be nurtured, or is it something that is just inborn? How do we solve that question and bring out perspectives on it?
I think this is one of the most difficult questions ever to answer. You know, where does leadership come from? And can you train for leadership? So for 15-year-olds, let me give you this example of Virendra Sehwag, Rohit Sharma. I thought it'll come from you. Some cricketers, some of you watch. So there's an element of leadership which is like Rohit Sharma's timing, right? It's sort of gifted. It's somewhere from God or somewhere that you're born with. But there's a whole lot of leadership which can be learnt and taught and sort of got better at. So there's one part which is sort of innate, and I think there's a lot of parts which can be done. Now, at the school level, it should be starting at schools and colleges, and that's how you sort of build it. Obviously, all leadership is about a couple of simple things, right? It's about, firstly, knowing exactly what's the job and getting the job done. Having a huge execution culture, right? Secondly, if you lead a team of people, it's about keeping that team motivated. And third, of course, is the ability to look beyond the bend and see what's happening 5 years from now or 10 years from now. I think leadership in every domain is generally the same thing. But at the school level, for example, like Suman said, if you focus on growth as GDP and that's the end of the growth, it's like focusing in a school on academic marks, but a school has to be a lot more. So how do you give responsibility to students? How do they run things on their own? As he said, this event 2 years from now should be run by the students. 90% of this event, of deciding how to run it, how to, call panelists, who you know, who you'll call on your own, run the whole show, has to be done by the school. It should start at the school, and that happens through giving responsibility and taking responsibility for your actions, risking, making mistakes, learning from that. Having the humility to say you made a mistake. And unfortunately, when you see across the political spectrum, you don't see any humility about people saying, I made a mistake. And that's one of the fundamentals of leadership. So that's why I'm saying there's fundamentally something wrong where people can't stand up and say, we made a mistake in the way we are growing. And so I think it's a mix of all these things as a response to that. But I think we don't do enough in institutions to learn and teach leadership and have that conversation. And that's a huge challenge for all sorts of learning organizations across India. And we should be looking at how we are doing that.
Right, thank you so much. Any other perspectives on it? Or if we could have some perspectives on where are we poised as a culture of education? Is our education doing enough to build citizens who can probably get this country going forward?
Yep.
Or what is required of the education system to get this country going forward?
So actually, I had a thought which was in response to what Colonel Gopal said, but it probably dovetails into exactly what you're asking. I think, first of all, on leadership, there is always a degree of naturalness that you have, to your point, that you could be a born leader or you could train yourself. But what's more important to understand is that like everything else, and maybe holds more true for leadership, you need to practice it. And that's why initiatives like what Colonel Gopal mentioned, if you give more opportunities to people and if you give that at younger ages, obviously there is a greater chance to be able to practice and then grow as leaders and deliver as leaders. From an education point of view, and I think I was responding to it in the original point, but it now goes back to the education system. I think we do have lots of leaders in the country. It's not that there is not dearth of leadership. I think what is really missing is leaders who would contribute even if there is no vested interest, even if there is no personal agenda. They would contribute to society, they would contribute to the country. Going back to Suman's point of the soft part of the country, leadership for developing the nation and not developing just a particular objective,
yes.
right? I think that leadership needs to get ingrained through the education system. So I remember in class 1 and 2 or maybe till class 5, there used to be a book called Moral Science, right? Maybe I don't remember whether I hated it or loved it, but I do remember that I used to go through that class and that book. Now I don't know whether that did the right thing to me or something else, but I think that's something which the education system needs to figure out as to how to bring that concept in, that people can think of beyond themselves and their immediate families, and that's what leadership is about.
That is a very interesting point made. I will close my questions here. Can we have our ushers ready? Ma'am had a comment to make, so we will begin with her. Yes, I would request all of you to also introduce your...
One student, one adult.
Yes, we'll do, okay. Sir always sub-moderates along with me, so I'm here.
Ma'am, can
So
you
we will do one adult and we'll do one student. So we'll go to ma'am in the green dupatta. I'm so sorry. Please do introduce yourself. And we will go to one of the students here. I will come to you. Yes. Can we have the usher ready here with the other mic? Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Avantika. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So it was a very interesting discussion we had this morning, and it's a very good thing that you've started, and I hope you keep going on. Very interesting remarks. I want to take off from where Vikas left. That is that 250 strong you have, who have already made it or will be making it. But what about that 750? Okay? So how do you take the nation forward with that 750 to that GDP, which we have managed to change and become the fastest growing nation in the world after the base figures changed in 12-13? So now we are the fastest growing nation in the world. But what about that 750 million? Where is our education system today? I'm sorry to say we are not doing enough with our youth, with our children. And I think I'm not talking about Shivnadar School, so please excuse me. I'm talking about all the children, about all the children who are there in the villages. We are going to have an influx of urbanization, right? Why are people coming to the cities? Because the facilities are there in the cities. But if you make counter magnets if you're having the education system, if you're having facilities right down there in the villages, there will be no need for such a massive migration to cities.
Perfect. So, in fact, it's very interesting when we talk about that part of India, sometimes, in discussions it's referred to as the other India. And I find the word other very interesting there. We've already othered that India that we as an urban population are not a part of. Is there any comment that we can make for the aspirations of that India, which we have very conveniently othered, even in our discussions?
Well, probably Vikas is in the best position to make that comment, but the only one observation that I'd like to make is that about 20 years ago, we did, look at the bottom of the pyramid approach to development. But I guess as the economy opened up, the pressures were so immense at that point in time because we all know that we had defaulted and we had to take some very urgent measures, and those measures were not determined only by us. They were IMF and other economic powers that were deciding for us what should be our priority in the next 10 years in terms of where we should look at in terms of reforms, what sectors we should open up for global investment. That's where we sort of lost our bottom of pyramid approach to development, and we have never really been able to do it. And I do agree that the access to opportunity, unless we create a level playing field for the rural India and the urban India, as far as the fulfillment of the aspirations of the youth are concerned, we will find it very difficult to cope up with the pressures that we keep building up. We have all seen what happened in Haryana a few months ago. You don't expect that in a fastest growing economy 60 kilometers from the capital of the city. So obviously, there is something terribly wrong with which we are approaching our policy making in terms of development. I don't have any answer. I can probably only scale up your concern.
Yeah. So I think one of the ways we should do the dialogue, sorry,
Yes.
moderator, is that obviously you can make comments which don't necessarily need answers because you have enough knowledge and wisdom out there, including students, so which is fine. But just one point on the point Avantika made. For children, it's important to understand, because you are 15 and figuring the world and becoming adult, is that India's gone through a phase where we sort of did not grow with the manufacturing sector. The whole world, China particularly, went hugely to manufacturing as the way to go for their growth. India went through the technology route, and therefore much of the new jobs we have created are in one sector, which is the service sector, technology, right? And that's going to come back to bite us because it looked very good with the GDP numbers, but there's this huge void of what to do with the 750 million people who's the workforce, and the one work they could do was in the manufacturing sector. And we got beaten by China out there, right? So we don't manufacture enough, and because of that, we may not be innovating enough, and we don't have a culture of being creative and innovative. So that's one problem to fix for the young, right? But that's a major issue to worry about.
Excellent.
Okay, I think, I just want to add a few numbers which I think give some perspective. So yes, the fastest economy in the world, absolutely. But the RBI governor used an old Indian saying, "Andho mein khana raja." 7%, the fastest is not terribly impressive. Also, there was an interesting presentation that the vice chairman of the Niti Aayog made. He said, by 2030 we will be a 10 trillion economy and we will have wiped out poverty. So I was very struck by this. So I asked to see the presentation, and his assumptions were quite interesting. He assumed that India will grow at 10% year on year for the next 15 years, which, by the way, has never been done in recorded economic history. And then I said, okay, so great, how are you going to achieve it? And they didn't have a plan as such. There was just a set of numbers. And just to further put that into perspective, if we actually do this, if we actually grow at 10% year on year for straight 15 years, which has never been done, we will then reach the GDP that the US is at today. On a population that is 4 times, our population is 4 times larger than theirs. So, the per capita income is going to be split that much. which is, I think, just a little number which we should bear in mind. I think the point is absolutely taken that we need to focus a lot more on the education sector. I think there have been some very heartening initiatives. For example, there was Abhay Anand Super 30 in Bihar. He sort of coaches these kids and they seem to regularly crack the IIT. Incidentally, the army took up this project in Kashmir. They did a Super 30 in Kashmir as well, and a lot of those kids got through the IITs as well. But that is something that is being done at an individual level. I think it is something that the government needs to take up much more actively on an institutionalized basis. I think at the very least we should double the education budget, and not just double it, but also use that money better. There have been some very interesting initiatives. There is a gentleman called Dr. Devi Shetty, who runs a place called the Shankar Hridayalaya, where they do heart surgeries at about 1/10 the cost of what it costs in a normal hospital. Again, that's something that we need to look at, take lessons from, institutionalize. But I think one thing that worries me and one thing I'd definitely like to see changed is, for example, there's something called the GST bill, right? So it's been calculated that if the GST bill were to pass, it would increase India's growth rate by at least 2%. We could go from 7% to 9%, which would bring us closer to that 10% figure. Now the Congress, when the Congress was running the country, the Congress brought this UPA bill. The BJP blocked it for 8 years. They simply would not let it pass. When the BJP took office, the BJP immediately brought the GST bill, which means that there was nothing wrong with the bill per se. But this time the Congress is blocking it. Now this was a bill that the Congress was pushing while it was in office. So there's nothing wrong with the bill, but this kind of obstructionism will go on and it costs the country. So I really think maybe we need to look at some sort of constitutional amendment whereby, of course, the downside is that this is a bill that most people agree is good. You could also have a negative bill, a bill that is not good, that is divisive, that can be pushed through by brute majority. So maybe you need to have some kind of mechanism whereby maybe the president and maybe he can appoint a panel of Supreme Court judges or some technocrats or whatever, where if they deem that a bill is fine, then it has to be discussed and it has to be passed within a certain time frame. Maybe. Just a thought out there.
All right. Yes. Okay. Yes, please do quickly. Yes.
Very quickly. No, I think I'll attempt to answer Avantika's question. There is no easy answer, but I'll attempt to answer it. And to make that, to answer that, I'll make a point. I think we have this issue of, everybody running after the same thing, right? So the Super 13 is fantastic. What Vikas talked of, and there were earlier examples of that too. But they're still running after the same thing. But is the IIT engineer doing the right thing? We don't know, right? What I'm getting to is that there's another statistic. So India's contribution to agriculture, the percentage of contribution that India does, or agriculture's contribution to Indian GDP is twice that of the world average. Okay, the respective contributions. To give you numbers, the world average is 6.1. India is 17. Wow. Right? That's what agriculture contributes. You should play upon your strengths. Okay? So I think what we should be doing is to really help agriculture get better. Innovation in agriculture, technology in agriculture, do more stuff in agriculture, and let the rural people develop themselves more and more. I'm not stopping some of the bright ones there from moving into other opportunities. It's not to undermine that, but there's enough to do. And then add to it, 70% of India's land is cultivable. Again, that's probably the largest ever in the world, right? So you have an opportunity. Yeah, we do need to do something about basic education in the rural sector. That needs more to be done. But in terms of what opportunities exist, I think agriculture itself offers a huge opportunity.
Absolutely. It just, I'm so sorry, I'll also add to that discussion. It reminds me of this beautiful village. Probably some of you can go back and research, called Hivre Bazar, which lies in Maharashtra. Now, this was an arid village, no water, no livelihood happening, tremendous out-migration. People just left the village because the land had turned all dry. And then there were a couple of people. This was the time your Panchayat Act and the municipal acts had come in around the early 90s. And a couple of educated people from that village who had been educated outside and who had enough technology education, they came back to the village for the village elections. And would you believe it? That village today has 50 millionaires. It has its own, it didn't have a school. Now it has an inter-college for women because they wouldn't send the women out. And every person in the village has at least 25,000 rupees as reserve in their banks. Probably something to ponder upon if we do invest in the right areas. What are the kind of changes that we are looking at? And Gopal sir, I think the other India deserved at least this much of discussion going because it's been largely, stationed in the urban India. But going forward, please also tell me if you want to address your questions to a particular panelist. I'll have just one, yes.
I'm not supposed to keep moderating, but I am. We need at least lots of questions, and they can be comments, and our panelists will reduce the answer to only one
minute,
panelist and
yeah.
2 minutes.
Okay.
So you can take as much time.
I was about to say that.
So let's go to the
All right,
students, yeah.
can we have two questions? I'll take two questions. Dakshita and Aditya. Yes.
My question was that sir said that we don't have very good relations with our neighbors, and so what could we do to get better relations with our neighbors so we could get
All right, that's a
developing more?
defense and geography and question. Suman sir made that comment, but Gopal sir should answer it.
Okay, so I'll make it really short. You know, we know that we have a problem with Pakistan. We know that we are not sure about China. But just consider this, that the problems in Syria, because Syria has imploded and sort of broken up, is impacting Europe. And they don't know how to handle it. And you have Pakistan right next to you with 200 million people, ready and maybe willing to implode, and all that problem is going to come to you, to us, right? So the first thing we have to do is to have peace in whatever way with a country like Pakistan, right? Peace and not war. Because if there is war and there's implosion, you got 200 million people who don't know what to do, and they'll come to you. And they'll take your water and your resources and your everything else. It's not you or they, but the fact is that it's not a great situation to have if you have a problem with Pakistan and there's an implosion in Pakistan. So continuing to be at peace and being powerful to make that peace going is extremely important.
Aditya, crisp question.
Yes, so it's just something I was reflecting upon. I just wanted to talk to Colonel Gopal sir. It's actually, I was sitting with my uncle and I was having a chat because I want to become an army officer. So I thought about, I was just planning out my career, and he said that in the world that we have today, where money is the big factor, we have economic fights. He says, what's the use of fighting with guns when you're fighting bankruptcy?
All right.
So I've sort of partially answered that in the earlier, response, that having a military is not about having to fight. Having a strong military is about keeping peace, right? People won't fight with you because you got the bigger muscles, right? So you need to keep the bigger muscles, right? And that's a deterrent to going into war, right? So having peace is what armies are for, right? It's not about having war.
All right. Can
Well,
we
I
have...
also want to add the army officers are very well paid now, so that is not really an issue anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and let me also add very good pensions now.
Yes, that's right.
When I left the army, my salary was 1/3 of the pension I get now.
Can we have the mic sent to sir, who has been raising his hand since a long time? And maybe have a student again after that. Someone from here. Yes, Raghav, can you give the mic here? Sir, your question.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi. I'm Vineet Dhaiya. So first, I'm glad to see when I saw the results of that little, the options that we had, that there are around 35% who said maybe, and I'm glad that I'm in a good company because I myself press that option. The point I'm trying to make, and I fully agree with what was said, that what happens is that whenever we have an opinion, and even I see in student, so generally everybody tries to categorize in whose side are you? I mean, are you for yes? Are you for no? And I strongly believe that there's a middle path, there's an alternative. And I hardly see people debating on what is that middle path. So it's kind of very easy to look at, this is India's time. These many people said yes, these many people said no. But what about the third voice who says maybe? And that's, I think, where we don't motivate people to come out. And that's why things like we have a view, but we do not have a complete view. Because there are missing parts which actually needs to be brought together. So I think when we say that we need to be there, is it India's thing or not, don't you think we have a big gap in terms of not encouraging the maybes and a middle path? And how do you plan to handle this?
So basically you're saying more people, convert people towards believing. I'm just trying to understand the question better.
So the question is that whenever we do such debates and whenever we, talk about a certain point, even if you see in the politics or no, we generally tend to categorize people, are you with us or are you against us? Tell us very clearly. Don't say you are neither there, not there.
Right.
So I think this is a big gap that I see. Unless we address this gap, it's very difficult to actually have a complete view.
Right.
We'll
So-
just have one side of the story.
Right. So, in a manner, probably that's why we ran the panel towards strengths and then towards challenges, so that we get all the views in. And then we can't sitting here probably decide whether this will be India's century or not, but probably we'll have some strong opinions by the time we go back home on 8. But thank you for your comment. I will move over to the next question. Yes, here, I need the mic here. Who goes after that? Is there any parent who wants to pose a question? Sir in blue there. Can you take the mic, Piche? Thank you. Yes. All right. Yes.
I'm Yajas.
Stand up.
Yeah. I'm Yajas. My question is to Swapan sir. Sir, you said that there are different factors that would lead India to become a global superpower. Like, I didn't understand how come, sir, spirituality and world peace. How can we say that?
Very good.
Yes, that's a good question.
Thank
Lovely.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for picking it up, right? I think those are the two most unlikely dimensions to talk about. So the world peace is, there's lots of things which Colonel Gopal's already mentioned, which bring out India's role in world peace. What I would add to it is that, and goes back to the multicultural and pluralism discussion. See, we as a set of people are probably the best in terms of being able to listen, discuss, and be open. And we always point out very quickly the slightest danger we see to it. We are up in arms saying, hey, stop it. Don't be intolerant, right? You saw this group talk about it. Vikas mentioned about it. He made a specific point about how to approach social media on it, right? So we're very conscious of being able to work through people, bring them together as a thought, as an objective. We all want to do that always. Of course, there are some of us who may not be doing that, but in general, we do that. And if you look at organizations or countries across the world, and I travel abroad and I see people across the world, I don't find that trait anywhere else, right? In general, there will be always some people who would do it. And that makes us probably somebody who's most well poised to be able to, go and handle world peace. The second point is, again, going back to Colonel Gopal's point about the size of your military is from a peace perspective and not a war perspective. Now, because we are so big and we have such a large border, we have a huge military, right? We have a very significant military, right? Now, we don't have that military to go and win wars and, annex some other country. So whenever there is a problem in the world, this military can actually, and has always played a great role in being able to bring back peace over there. Now, that's something which can be leveraged, and India will, unlike a few other countries, and I'm not going to spur a debate saying which countries, India's objective always in these missions, by and large, is to bring back the peace and not any other vested interest, right? So that's why we think we could be a dominant player in restoring world peace whenever so required. So that's on world peace. On spirituality, goes back to, that's one thing that when you rewind, you know that your depths, are far too, are far too deep, right? I think our civilizations go back well in time, right? We are probably the oldest civilization in many senses of the word. The kind of knowledge that is already there in this country in terms of what spirituality means is far, far ahead. You can quote several spiritual leaders, political leaders who've had a spiritual inclination, take Swami Vivekananda, take anybody and look at the world speeches, you'll find them that they've brought out what India's depth in spirituality is. And I think the world in the last 10, 15 years has started to recognize it. So my comment there was not built on any great understanding of spirituality. I mean, I don't think I'm there yet. But in terms of, seeing the world reckon India's place in that and not reckon somebody else's place in that is where I see India being able to build on that whole area. Does that make sense?
Right. Can I have the mic in the front? Shashi ma'am would like to make a comment on it.
In fact, thank you for what you mentioned right now. My question is more a concern. We do move towards many countries which in the economic hierarchy are more appealing in terms of our curriculum. And this question is rooted in what schools in India look for as strengthening the culture component that we were talking about. And I'm not talking about the esoteric knowledge in arts, theatre, literature, etc. But there are countries like Bhutan, Norway, who have really budgeted themselves very mindfully towards what they teach their children, even Finland. But Bhutan and Norway really are some places to focus upon in terms of school curriculum. I think Avantika did mention that we in India, I'm not talking about Shiv Nadu schools, but I'm talking about all schools. I'm talking about what is our focus for education, what is the cultural component in education that we prize and appreciate and take forward. What is the messaging that children get? It's easy to say that spirituality is being there. And there's a very nice book by Rukmini Shekhar on making difference for India, and where she's talking about, there's the village which Gandhi, of course, and there is a very nice book by Shekhar Chandra who's written on. Nobody reads these books because some of them are in Hindi or regional literature. That's again my question. Are we going to be able to make the most of that strength, that energy that we're talking about, if we are not inclusive in our curriculum design and dissemination in schools? And this is more a concern and also a question, because it's rarely that you get a panel which is so erudite and so involved. So are we doing the right things by turning only to a few countries for where the education for our children needs to be? Or do we have many, many more options available that we need to turn to? Thank you.
Thank you for
There's Sherin Tobgay of Bhutan, and he's really caught my attention. I've fallen in love with him. We need to see those ED talks as well. And it's Bhutan. It's got just very little, but lots of resources in environment.
In fact, Norway is perhaps the role model in that. And I'm so glad that you mentioned, because I also wanted to mention when I talked about soft power, because they and countries like Norway and Bhutan took a conscious decision that they want to focus on the soft power, that they want to find a place in the world by influencing the world not through money power or military power, but through their thought process. And that is exactly why, sitting here so far away, we are discussing a small Scandinavian country, which today has provoked you enough, set you enough to think, to be able to suggest that we should look at that. Now that is the power of soft power. Right? And we need to examine those very clearly. And of course, I mean, one can have a full-fledged discussion on that. But I completely endorse your point, and I would like to sort of second it, that please look at it and examine it more closely in terms of your school.
Right. It's very interesting, Shashi ma'am, you asked that question. I think you should also answer that question for a lot of us here, because you are in a position to. And moving on, do we have any other comments on that question? We'll move on, ma'am. And we have a question from the gentleman. Yeah.
Yeah, so my comment is coming out of the comments which were made by Mr. Suman, and he talked about smart cities, and because I've been involved with this for almost 2 years, so I would like to just mention that it is not the necessity. It is a necessity. It is not the luxury that we are actually investing in our cities, because in the next 15 years, almost 300 million people are going to come to the cities additionally, and that is going to be almost the population of United States of America. So whatever we do, people are going to come to the cities, and we have to provide the basic facilities to the resident of the cities. That is one thing. The second thing is that thinking about smart cities, that it is just going to be the internet, it is just going to be the ICT, is wrong. There are various other things which are happening as per the initiative. I was sitting in the standard making committee yesterday, and out of the 600 indicators which were envisaged for looking at the smartness of the city, 106 were on the education. So there are a lot of things which are actually happening on education. There are a lot of things which are being thought about basic health facilities, power, water. So all these things which are going to create the livable city, I would say. I would not say smart city. That's a misnomer which many of us think is going to be, making the city where everywhere the internet is going to be available and things like that. So on the third point you mentioned about that we should think about the culture of the cities and all that. There are many things again which are happening. I belong to Varanasi. I'm involved in a project there with the authorities and PwC where we are trying to develop the identity for that city. The 5,000 years of identity of that city is being envisaged. And that is something which is going to get rolled out if it is approved by the authorities. So there are many things which are happening. We should not undermine the efforts of the government which is very, very, pivotal for the growth of this country. So that's the limited comment I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please do.
Well, first of all, I want to very clearly clarify that I have no quarrel with the proposition of smart cities. We need smart cities and we need them for the reasons that you mentioned, and I fully support them. So I am not saying that smart cities are not needed or they are being done the wrong way. What I am saying is that alongside smart cities, you need thinking cities as well. Now, the very reason, I did expect you to sort of touch on that aspect as well. For me, when I think of a thinking city, what I really mean is that when I get down from the metro train into the metro station, I, like in London Underground, see someone playing a guitar and showing his talent. I see what you see happening in Meherchand Market in Lodi Colony, where you have wall streets which you don't have to struggle knocking the doors of MCDs and NDMCs of the world to take permissions from, where you have this as a policy of this city, where artists are encouraged to flourish. When I talk of thinking city, I see culture omnipresent, something as a stress buster. Please tell me, how many museums are you planning as a part of Smart City in Varanasi? I can come and do 20 for you if you allow that as a policy. Smart cities are needed, but integrate them with the soft side, build museums. How many art galleries are you planning? Depending on the size of the city, how many bookstores? Are you inviting a tender, global tender or a national tender for bookstores to come and open bookstores? I certainly will. I certainly will. And I'll be happy to meet with you and share my ideas.
Yes, I think this discussion can go on. I know I'm going to stop this discussion here. Thank you. And we'll go to Maitrey for the next question.
My name is Maitrey. Basically, I have been listening that GDP, India is the fastest growing GDP and all of that. So how is this fastest growing GDP, that 7% rate of India growing, is going to help us making this century as India's century?
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into economics, please.
Okay. So basically when we talk about GDP growth, right, what we are saying is, okay, so this is the total. Okay, so you'll study it in economics eventually, but the basic point is how much will your economy grow, right? And when your economy grows to a certain level, a lot of things flow. So for example, you have employment for people, but apart from that, you also have more money to spend on defense. You have more money to spend on a bigger army. You also have more money to spend on education, on higher education, and also you can spend a lot more money on cultural activities. So all of which goes into making a superpower, for want of a better word. Whether it's a military superpower, whether it is a cultural superpower, whether indeed it is a sporting superpower, it sort of all begins from faster GDP. And that's again historically what you see. So for example, the US is a sporting superpower precisely because they have the money to invest in sports as well. It's also a cultural superpower. Hollywood is the sort of largest entertainment industry in the world because they have a large enough market of people who watch movies, and therefore they can afford to make those movies which then get exported to the rest of the world, which is then seen by the rest of the world. Yeah, so that's how it all links back up.
I just want to add a very quick comment. I think it's very relevant, and this is a very important observation that Vikas made, that there's so much that you can do with the money. And I think the most important thing besides all that, what you can do is create a happiness quotient for you. Because what you know, the power of the money also is to be able to allow you to do what you want to do, which also means a degree of satisfaction and the happiness quotient, and which is what Bhutan is all about, happiness quotient of its citizens. And for that you need money, of course.
That also allows Bill Gates to retire and then go around combating malaria across the world.
Excellent. We just have time for 2 more questions. Can we give both those questions to our students, please? By the permission of everyone present here and assumed assent. The mics have been given. All right. So my students are leading.
I'm Arushi, and my question is that till now China is the most populated country, and they have done the rule that every couple needs to have only one child. But now the India is trying to become the most populated country. But how will the India have space to accumulate with all those people?
All right. Thank you for the wonderful. What's your name?
Arushi.
Arushi.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that.
Arushi, should we also have a law which says everyone can have only one child?
No,
Why?
I don't know.
Because it will solve the problem. We will have, for every mother and father, there will be only one child, which is what China did for 30 years. So what really happened in China is that as the mother and father became grandfather, and that one child had a husband and one more child, there were no cousins in China. There were no brothers and sisters. And no one was related to anyone by the time 3 generations happened. So do you think it's a good idea that we should have only one child for every mother and father?
Maybe.
So there we have a maybe, sir. You will be happy.
If I can very quickly.
But it's a very good question. It's a wonderful
I think
question.
it's a wonderful question, and I just want to make one little point. You know, I'm hoping a lot of you would have read the paper today, The Times of India. So our lead story, in fact, was that in cities, in Indian cities, the fertility rate is now lower than in the US or in Australia. You know, so really development is the best.
Development and education.
And
education
sort of
as
go
well.
hand in hand.
But yes, in another 10 years, 2025, India will become the most populous country in the world. And it's a very good question because we are not even anywhere near the size of China, or like Vikas said, USA with 250 million people is 2.5 times our size, right? And India with this 1.45 billion people will be the most populous country, and we'll all be fighting for resources. It's a very good question.
Thank you. And we had someone here who stood up. Please complete your question.
So I have the.
What's your name?
Simran. So I have a question for sir. So basically, most of the Indians are migrating to different countries because they ain't getting business and proper wages. So you just stated that India is becoming more stable in the economic field. So what is still the reason that people are still going out, leaving their own country behind?
Excellent question. So I think you know, I mean, it's not an easy answer. There are multiple sort of aspects to it, but I think one is, you know, there is, at this all said and done, if you sort of aspire to be the best in the world, are we still able to provide that facility here? I'm not so sure. You know, so if you sort of want to be the best software engineer that you can be, will you live in India or will you go to Silicon Valley? So we need to work towards that. But equally, having said that, there is a lot of reverse migration, because you see a lot of people who've been living abroad now sort of moving back to India because they feel that, you know, this is where the growth is and this is where the opportunity is. There are a lot of people who like to go abroad to get educated because they feel that the education system abroad you know, is more sort of holistic, more rounded, which again is I think something that is being addressed by a few universities, but not really by all universities. But I think hopefully in the next you know, we've had this whole, in fact, discussion about what was called brain drain. You know, a lot of Indians going abroad, and now we feel that that's not necessarily a bad thing, because what it has done is that it has expanded the Indian influence abroad substantially, and it's also got us back remittances. So, you know, will India be able to retain its best talent? I think it will in the near future. But equally, we shouldn't be sort of, worried about people going abroad, because in a networked world, increasingly, it really doesn't matter where they are, as long as they're doing good for India.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'm so sorry. We will have to wrap the discussion up very soon now. We'll have one last question from the gentleman here. And Vaibhav, could you please pose your question?
Hi, I'm Vaibhav, and my question is actually to all the panelists. I know it's another debate, but Sumant mentioned something that got me thinking to this. He mentioned Haryana. So, and some lady mentioned 750 million Indians. Is reservation an answer to get those 750 million up? Or is that a dichotomy because it's about rewarding a culture of mediocrity versus giving an equal pedestal?
All right, let's revert to Mandal Commission. Yes, please.
Very quick, very quick. So I think I have a very statistical answer to your question. That's the reason I wanted to go first. So there are 4,695 communities in India. If you make a reservation for all of them, you might as well actually scrap the whole concept of reservation and say that the 1% or 0.1% of all jobs will go to each community. So it is just not feasible to do reservation or implement that in our country. And there is no way it can help solve the problems that we spoke about.
All right, thank you. That was a very, very quick comment. Anyone else would like to address that question?
You can ask one more question.
Okay, so we have space for one more question.
Okay,
so I want the mic to go to the child in the red shirt. Yes, he was the first to raise his hand. I'm sorry I didn't come to you.
Fastest and first, yeah.
Hi, my name is Trishan, and unfortunately I was part of that group who voted for option B, which said no, this is not India's century.
Please do introduce yourself also.
I did, Trishan.
Okay.
So yeah, I was part of that group which voted for option B. And that's quite unfortunate. But I say so because right now what's happening is all the people in power, all the parties in power, for example, BJP, AAP, etc., they're all just playing a blame game. And right now we really, really need to start solving problems if we want to make this India's century. So my question is, how do we tackle this problem? Because in my eyes, it's quite a big problem.
The problem being?
That we are just playing a blame game and we aren't solving problems.
Join politics and become the Prime Minister. You got it?
Okay. Yes, Swapan, please.
Sorry, somebody else wants to. I don't want to be the first all the time.
No, but I think that the answer actually lies in what Kanagopal mentioned, that, we have to be the change makers. You just can't expect things to change just sitting here. We have to, if you believe very strongly, start cultivating yourself for that. And we need leaders who are statesmen.
Absolutely.
And surely, yes. So probably the answer lies in your own question.
Absolutely. Be the change. Be the change.
Let me just add to
yes.
it. It's a point that one can make. So since you started with talking about that you were part of the 34% group, and you also said that was unfortunate. So I'm just building on that. So I see a sense that you do want to go to the other side, right? So just think about this, that certain problems are very deep-rooted, and they take a lot of time to change, right? Social changes, in fact, take the longest. I know if you're a biology student, or if some of you would have studied biology for sure. So we have an organ called appendix in our bodies, right? That organ was rendered redundant from an evolutionary perspective hundreds of years ago, but we still have it, right? So it takes time to make a change happen. That's what happened in biological evolution, that takes time in social evolution. What I'm trying to get across to you is that one of the risks that we run is to get frustrated or disillusioned with losing sight of our strengths because of the challenges that we have over here. This is one of the challenges. I'm pretty confident that, going back to what Colonel Gopal said, people like you come up and think of it in the right way, and they be the change. They make that change, and we just play upon our strengths and make it.
So I just want to add one line that I read from Thomas Friedman, which has stayed with me. And he said, there are sort of revolutions come and go, but true long-lasting revolutions take 21 years. That's what it takes for a new generation.
Yes, so let's resolve in this room today that we will make sure that it becomes India's century by contributing to it in our own little way.
All right. Oh, that's a perfect note on which we can wrap. No, we will need to put a lid on the questions for now, but that doesn't mean you can't reach out to us. You know our mail IDs, you know our Twitter IDs, you know our Facebook page. Leave your comments. We will have the panelists come in and answer it online for all of you. We can all stay connected and the discussions can keep going on. And before I say my thank yous or I invite Aryan to give a vote of thanks, we will have the poll once again. Let's see the sway. Because this has been a rather mixed discussion today. And can we have the question on the screen again? Your clickers ready, please. And your time starts now. Meanwhile, you can think what the sway would be like and check if you're correct. What will it be, maximum?
A.
A? All right.
Wow.
Wow.
Oh, it's the same, man.
So
Yes.
versus a 44% yes earlier, we have 49% yes, which is a 5% sway in yes, versus 21% no. It's versus 18%. Yeah, 21% no. It's 18%. So out of the 5% yes, 3% have moved from no to yes, and 2% have moved from maybe to yes.
So might I say that the
I'm one of
maybes
those.
are very stubborn? You're almost
No,
there.
I moved from C to A.
Wonderful.
That was because I want to stay optimistic, and I want this room also to stay optimistic.
Yes.
I'm optimistic that we will make it happen.
Thank you so much. May I invite Aryan onto the podium to give the vote of thanks, please?
Good afternoon. This was a thoroughly informative and extremely enjoyable session. On behalf of Shiv Nadar School Noida, I express our deepest gratitude to the panelists for finding time to be with us today. Listening to their views, thoughts, and analysis certainly enriched all of us present here. May I now request Shashi ma'am, Principal Shiv Nadar School Noida, to kindly come on stage and present a small token of gratitude to our panelists. We thank Mr. Suman Batra for joining us here today. Thank you so much, sir. We thank Colonel Gopal for sharing his views on this topic.
Thank you.
We also thank Mr. Swapan Johri for giving us his insights on this topic.
Sure, I think, yeah, we must. Thank you.
And lastly, we thank Mr. Vikas Singh for being with us here today. Thank you so much, sir. We also thank all the parents, teachers, and students for attending the dialogue and would request them to join us for lunch in the dining hall. Thank you.
All right. We have a change in modalities. What is any program without some sensational additions? Shashi ma'am wants to add some comments. Yes,
I just wanted to say thank you to the panelists, to the parents, and to the students. I think we have a job to do to make this India's century. Let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, thank you to all the students, all the parents and the teachers who took our time for this. And while you go on for lunch, please do leave your clickers with us. Can I have the volunteers
Good point.
there to collect all the clickers? Thank you.